So here's the plan. Here's the strategy. We're going to begin with some of the questions on the cards, and I'm going to try the best I could in just the few minutes that I had. I tried to skim through them and pick out some where there was multiples of the same question or similar questions. And we'll start with that, and then we'll have an open time of an open mic, and we got a couple of guys with microphones who will walk to you because we want to make sure everybody can hear the question.
You know what we'll try to do also, because people always say, I have a quick question. Really? Okay, so the question's quick. The problem is the answer's not quick.
Right.
So what we're going to try to do is to really give you, so it might sound a little bit too concise, right? Because we're just going to try to give you the briefest possible answer so we can get to the most possible questions. Does that sound fair?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's do it.
So I'm going to kick it off.
It's like Jeopardy.
I had a multiple of this one, shockingly, actually. What is a hot dog smoothie? I had two of those.
No, you did not. Did you write both of them?
No, I didn't write either one of them. I'm just, look.
I can tell you what it is.
Possible.
It's gross.
All right. See?
Next question.
Boom.
That was easy. Push the button.
Yeah. Here's another one. This one's particularly for Jim. I watched a YouTube video where you said that you never carry a gun but a Bible. Where in the world did you get a Bible holster?
I got it from a guy in Maine named Ken Graves. He's a pastor up in Maine.
Okay.
And he makes these Bible holsters. And I don't happen to have my Bible holster today. But yeah, so I do carry a Bible holster. It's like it's a little bit uncomfortable, and then when you stand, it like sticks way out.
Oh yeah.
So I always kind of feel like maybe I shouldn't wear it all the time, but
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
See, aren't we learning things like crazy here? It's great. Okay. In the first session, we talked about the variations between different manuscripts of the Gospels. How do we reconcile the inerrancy of Scripture with the fact that there are obvious variations of the manuscripts?
Okay, so I think it's a matter of definitions. So what are we saying when we say inerrancy? What we say is that the original, the autograph, is the inerrant Word of God. But clearly we don't have the autograph anymore. So we are going to return reliably to the inerrant original. That make sense? Mm-hmm. But if we're saying that we don't have the originals, so we trust that we have, so in the end we end up with the inerrant Word of God because we are returning reliably to the inerrant original.
And I would add to that, one of the reasons that people care about an autograph that we don't have, a technical term, is because we love the Word of God so much. Some people have said, well, then it's worthless, and who cares? All we have are our translations. But think about it this way. When a Jehovah's Witness comes with a New World Translation to your house, and it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God, little g, that's a terrible translation, and I want to have the ability to say, you know what, that's a lousy translation of the Greek. If you just go a few verses down in the Greek, which that JW can't do anyway, but you can see that this is a false translation. I want the ability to get at the Word of God and be able to show that that translation's bogus. Now let's back it up a step. Somebody says to me, there is this Greek text, and it says whatever. If it's bogus, which we can use text criticism to be able to, this is done in every kind of literature, trying to get back to the original. I want to be able to say, I want the original. I'm not just going to follow this one you have because it's not right. And these principles show us that. So that's why there's this love of talking about the inerrancy of the original autograph. And if you want to read the description of it, it's called the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy, and you can find it online. And it's really important. I think it'll help you to read it.
Yeah, and I would just add to that too, a lot of the talk about discrepancies in the manuscripts gets overstated for especially a lot of people like Bart Ehrman in his book Misquoting Jesus, where he says there's something like 400,000 variants or whatever it is, and it's more than words in the New Testament. One of the things that's in that is spelling of words. It's not just adding a word or duplicating a word, but a lot of times it's spelling a word, and it's kind of anachronistic because spelling wasn't even standardized till the medieval period. So a lot of our manuscripts that misspell, they wouldn't have seen it as misspelled words.
Absolutely.
It was, you know what I mean?
Absolutely. One last thing on this. Short, quick answer. Impossible if I'm in the middle here, but sorry.
Yeah.
That's why we put you there.
That's right. So that's why you were sad. Right. I came back out.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is and Jim said it this morning, there's not a single doctrine that is affected by the variants in all of text criticism. It's one of the most amazing supernatural aspects of Christianity that we can go back so early, as he was talking about, so accurately, so reliably. It's boring stuff for scholars, and that's why it's really not a big deal, but people get freaked out about it because of the way people try to mispresent it.
I don't want to add to this answer, but I got to say this too. Just do a thought experiment with me. If I said, okay, to every critic of this, okay, you found a variation, I'll tell you what, I'll let you take the word out altogether. Just take it out. Better yet, I'll let you take the verse out. Every place you find a variant, I'll let you remove the entire verse as unreliable. No, better yet, I'll let you take out every third verse. No, better yet, I'll let you take out every other verse, period. So now you've taken out half the New Testament. No critic thinks that half the New Testament is unreliable.
That's right.
Okay, but if you took out half the New Testament,
Right.
what would you know about Jesus? Same stuff you know now. Because first of all,
Exactly right.
if you take it out of Luke, and it's in a synoptic, there's a good chance you haven't taken it out of Matthew, so it comes back in again.
Yeah.
You're not going to get rid of data. And even if you got rid of some data, you're still stuck with the guy who was born of a virgin, worked miracles, preached. You're stuck with the same Jesus. So why are we
Absolutely.
even talking about this?
That's right.
Because even if we took out every other verse, which they're not saying we should, you'd still be stuck with Jesus.
Yeah.
Very well
Yeah.
said.
Very good. This one's for Jim. It's an interesting question. When you first believed in Jesus, what did your dad say?
He thinks it's good. My dad thinks this is a very useful delusion. And he always tells me, do not mess with your siblings who are Mormon, because that's working for them. And he will go to a temple, to a ward. He'll go to the ward. He'll go to, when I was a pastor, he would come to our church. He'll sing hymns. He thinks they're beautiful. He would rather live in a country that is Christian than a country that isn't Christian. But he doesn't think it's true. It's just useful.
Yeah.
So he was happy.
Well, there's several questions related from parents about their kids, and I'll just give two variations of it. As parents of teens, how can I best prepare my kids to not leave their faith in the 20s? And the other one, who basically says that too, says, how does service to others play into that, or does it?
You did really well with this at lunch.
They're not leaving their faith in their 20s.
That's right.
They're leaving their faith between 10 and 17. If you ask them later on, they'll tell you. They aren't telling you until their 20s. But they aren't leaving their faith in their 20s. They're leaving their faith while they're with you. And all the statistics show that's true. We were talking to pastors at lunch, and one of the youth pastors at lunch, one of the children's pastors, said that's what he's seeing as well. He's absolutely right. This is exactly what's happening. Now, they're not sharing it with you. But the age of skepticism has dropped dramatically since the glowing rectangle. So we have to be aware of that at least. And it starts earlier, a lot earlier.
Mm-hmm. And what role would service play?
Well, I think I'm not big. Okay, I think it's a part. It plays a role, but remember, you won't ever serve as well as the Mormons do. They're willing to do so much more for a lie than you're willing to do for the truth. That's not even funny. Mm-hmm. But if it's just service, that isn't the only answer, because service can clearly lead you into a lie.
True.
So I think it has to be a combination of relationships and truth. Relationships and truth. Relationships and truth. If you think you just give your kid a book or some truth, but they don't have a strong relationship with you, we're in a world in which no one knows who to trust. I've got so many websites. Mine looks really good. You know why I made it look so darn good? Because all the other ones look really good too. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, hey, I got to at least be competitive, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that means I can't know who to trust. They all look the same.
Right.
So it's going to come down to, do they trust you as an authority in this area? Have you demonstrated any proficiency? They would go, I don't know about anything, but my dad's really smart. And he's been talking this stuff for years. So if he says it, I'm in. It's a relationship issue. Do they trust you as an authority?
What evidence or proof can we offer to the unbeliever who knows absolutely nothing about Christianity or church that Jesus is real and is the Messiah?
Well,
now you do it.
Should we give you a test or a quiz to see if you've been listening? I mean, there's one way that I think reaches so many westernized people is exactly what Jim is doing for us. I would say this, apologists sometimes give you the impression that the first thing you do is go to some defense the question hints at part of the answer, and that is that so many people in the Western world now don't even know anything about Jesus or biblical Christianity to begin with. So you can't do apologetics. You can't defend something that they don't even know what it is you're defending. So in a way, I like to think of apologetics, not in just a way, I think it is, in the most important sense, the flip side of the evangelistic coin. And as Jim said, he hinted at this, when we do evangelism, most of the time, I like to say it this way, we get a pink slip. And the rejection slip shouldn't be considered a rejection slip in the ultimate sense, because we don't know where we are, as he was saying, on that journey. But I got to make sure they understand what the gospel is. So in a very real way, I want to make it simple, and I want to make it relevant to the way they can understand it, not a bunch of gobbledygook theological or whatever terms. I want it where they can understand real simple things like, where did I come from? If they already believe in a God, I don't have to go there. But if they don't even believe in God, I may have to work on that. What's wrong with the world? They may just think it's just having too many Christians in the world or whatever. And what's the solution, right? If I go straight to Jesus, what's the solution? And they don't even believe in God, or they don't even have a clue as to what's wrong, without a problem that Jesus fixes, and so on. So there are many ways you can get at this, but I think it's crystal clear they have to understand what the good news is about before you even know how to go into the defense part.
It's hard, but I'll tell you, there's one book out there on the table that, now that I've sold all of our books, I can tell you this.
You guys did sell all your books like in an hour.
There's one book out there you guys need to get, and there's lots of books out there, they're all good, but one called Tactics by Greg Koukl, that is a really important book, because if you did nothing else, how about just asking a question?
Yep.
You don't need to make a defense yet. You don't know what the problem is.
What
would it take?
Yes.
What is it that keeps you from believing that Christianity is true? I mean, I don't know what to even say until I know what the problem is. Yeah. So I would ask that question. We also ask a couple of other pointed questions. What would it take? If they said, well, God would have to appear here and do something miraculous in front of me. Well, I clearly can't do that. So I guess you don't need anything from me then, right? Because you're asking for something I can't even provide. And I think that'll help people think about it a little bit. But I would also ask this question. If Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? Well, that's not true. Well, no, I'm not. Just go along with me. If I could demonstrate that it's true to everyone's satisfaction, would you then become a Christian? Well, you can't demonstrate that it's true. No, just go with me as a thought experiment.
Mm-hmm. All right.
And what you'll discover is, for a lot of people, even if it was true, they wouldn't go along with it. And so that's okay. Then at least you know what you're dealing with, and it's not going to be a head issue. And you won't spend a lot of time working in an area that isn't even the problem to begin with.
Yeah. In today's court of public emotion and media influence, it seems that evidence and due process have often been replaced by end justify the means agendas. How damaging is this lack of concern for truth and for the Christian's ability to engage in rational debate? And how did this happen so fast? Parenthetically, at the risk of sidelining us, it can't all be Trump's fault.
Okay.
Just reading the question here.
Got it.
Let's leave Trump out of it. Let's just go with the other part.
All right. I'm not touching this. Don't even try.
I did it first.
Turn that around.
Around in Kentucky, we have a thing, whose turn it is to pray. Whoever's hand goes up first. I had my hand at you first.
Oh, yeah.
I don't even remember the question is.
Okay,
all I heard was Trump.
I know.
Okay, so hang on.
It went nuclear, didn't it? Okay, let me read it again. In today's court of public emotion and media influence, it seems that evidence and due process have often been replaced by ends justify the means agendas. How damaging is this for the lack of concern for truth and for Christians' ability to engage in rational debate?
Well, I think it's true that in general, the tenor of the culture in westernized countries has become touchy-feely at the more popular level. So at one sort of stage, there are the gurus, the new high priests, the sort of atheistic people, the new atheists that are like, we're the smart people, we think for you, and if you don't believe like we do, then you're stupid. The unwashed masses kind of look at them and are scared of them, but they don't really believe like them. Most of people continue to be some kind of fuzzy believer in God or a world force or something. They say they believe in Jesus, but he was probably a sinner, not born of a virgin. I believe Jesus for my salvation, but you don't need Jesus only for salvation. They're very confused, right? So the trend has become not what is true, but how I feel. That is, I think, generally true. But it isn't true that people don't think that truth is important. So I think you have to get the issue of truth on the table without sounding like a philosopher. You have to read, as Jim pointed out, you have to diagnose a person. So some people, I may meet a guy on the street with no education, or if I'm in another country and a person's never been educated, I'm going to do this very differently. But the issue bottom line still is, as he's been saying all day, is this true? And how you go about that with a person, you have to read them in the kind of way they diagnose reality. And sometimes you have to just pull down something they're using as a silly sort of block, like, I don't believe in such things as truth. We all know that's just silly. That's a truth statement. It's self-defeating. Those are easy ones that you wish they would do, right? But you want to give them no ground to just hide from truth. You say, well, do you care if you get a true diagnosis when you're sick? Don't you even care about, what's really wrong with your car? You don't want the guy just to charge you for a new transmission if you don't need it. So what about what happens to you when you die, type of thing? It's not easy because the culture isn't friendly to us, but think of it this way. You could be living in Saudi Arabia where you're not even allowed to talk about it. So we may have to work a little harder than the good old days when I was younger, but it's part of what we're called to do.
And I think it cuts both ways, too. I mean, most of the new atheists that I know are modernist in their thinking. They believe that something is emphatically and demonstrably true, just the opposite of what we do. But they're going to try to get there through reason. And they're trying to reason with us toward their goal. Yep. So if all of us as a culture are slipping away from reason toward feeling, this also hurts their enterprise as much as it hurts our enterprise. What I've discovered is that almost everyone can get sloppy in their thinking on such things until a moment of crisis, especially a moment of personal crisis. When you're diagnosed with cancer, suddenly it doesn't matter how the doctor is feeling about your cancer. What matters is, does the doctor know anything about cancer? And so it's in a moment of personal crisis when you're now a victim of something and you want a trial to determine that the suspect is guilty for this crime he committed against you. Now suddenly you don't care about how people feel. You want jurors that are going to make the right decision based on the facts. So we typically can get sloppy in our thinking until we are at a point of personal crisis. So I try to tell people when they are still sloppy, I say, okay, I get it. I understand this is making you feel a certain way, and I can't really argue rationally with your emotional responses. So I'm just going to leave this with you, and I'm going to say this to you. If you're a human like me, a time is coming in your life when you'll reach a point of crisis. And I just want you to remember our conversation, because at that point, you're going to get very clear in your understanding of truth. And things will be important again. Call me, and let's talk then. Because right now, this is again, you're in a 4 category, and I can spend a lot of time talking to you, but something has to move you into a 3, and sometimes it's a point of crisis, and it's actually God allowing the point of crisis that moves you to begin with.
Yeah,
That's good.
And I would just add to that, I have seen a lessening of us as a culture, not just church, but in our nation, having less and less ability for calm, rational discussion without name calling. And I'm not talking about just politics, but theology, anything. The new atheists are the best at just calling people names, along with the arguments. And so,
but I can tell you, if you have a social media platform, so like we've all started kind of working in culture, so I have a big social media platform. I'm constantly interacting with people, and I am embarrassed on both sides.
Oh yeah,
every
absolutely.
day. I don't know if you guys realize this or not, but on Facebook, when people post under your articles, and I post probably about 20 articles a day that aren't mine, there are other people making the case for Christianity, and I will hear Christians and non-Christians dialogue with each other. And sometimes it's really embarrassing for the family. So I'm like, oh man, that doesn't sound very good. So I don't know if you realize this or not, but the person who posts the article can hide your comment. Did you know that? And you don't know you've been hidden because you can still see your comment, but nobody else can. so I can hide your comments, so I can stop this crazy dialogue in its tracks before it gets any worse. Because I've seen us as Christians be just as vile toward the other side. So we're so polarized right now that there's no reasonable middle. And so we have to remember there's a reasonable middle here, right? If it's not just that maybe I don't agree with you, it's that you're evil for not agreeing with me.
Absolutely.
And if we get to that point where all discussions are off, but I'll be honest with you, it's not just atheists who are doing that.
No, that's right.
We do that a lot too. So I'm so grateful for that hide button. I use it a lot every day.
Yeah. Well, I just think as Christians, we represent Jesus online. We don't cease being an ambassador of Christ when we go online. So do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Tweet like Jesus.
Somebody said that, yeah.
There you go.
All right. How do you respond to Spurgeon on this? We have a Spurgeon quote.
Oh, my.
This is teed up for you, Dr. Cabel.
What?
That's right.
The gospel is like a caged lion. It does not need to be defended. It simply needs to be let out of its cage.
Well, in one sense, it's certainly true. I mean, the Word of God, the gospel is the power of salvation, period, to everyone who believes. It's not, I'm strong enough, I'm smart enough, I've got enough will, I can break you down. So obviously that's true. I don't know that particular Spurgeon quote, so I'm not going to, until I've seen the quote, whether I'm going to actually attribute it to him. But if he did say it and it sounded like the way he's doing it, then it's not even biblical. Paul said, I've been appointed to be for the defense of the gospel, Philippians 1:16. Nobody was a more passionate defender of the gospel than the Apostle Paul, and he was so good at it. He said, I do anything and everything so that by every means I can save some. And he knows that he can't save anybody, but he would do anything. He was so good at, no matter what the culture he was with a timeless gospel, but pouring his heart out in a different way to present it and to defend it. So to me, it's absurd if a person says, I reject Jesus, and I say, well, I can't defend, and I say, what's your reason? And they say, because my uncle was a deacon and he was a hypocrite, and I say, well, the gospel's good enough. I don't need to say anything more. That's absurd. Mm-hmm. That's a softball. I say, so you quit eating at restaurants because you got a bad meal or whatever. I mean, you don't just quit talking to the unbeliever. You want to keep the gospel conversation going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That was so good, I don't even just add to that. That's exactly right.
Wow, I've arrived.
I was thinking, there's like 5 things I want to say, but now there's nothing I want to say.
Wow. Outstanding. Would your book, and I'm assuming it's yours, Jim, but it could be yours too, Dr. Cabel, would your book be a help for those kids that have gone to college, learned a different view, convinced about another explanation, and doubt Jesus was here and he's the Son of God?
Yes. I will answer yes.
Well, I think it may not be. So, were we just talking about in the pastors, or we talking about on the stage? I can't remember.
The pastors.
We get all the time. We get asked, to sign a book, and they're not going to read it. If your student is now 24, your kid's now 24, and he or she is no longer a Christian. I mean, it's so. What we want to do is, what can I do without investing any of my own time or effort to get my kid back? Ouch. Am I right? Yes. So, do you have a book I can just give them? A place I can send them to watch something? Because I don't want to have to learn the case and explain it to my kid. Is that what I'm hearing? Feels that way to me. Mm-hmm. Okay. See, the bad thing about cops is that you only call us when you got a problem. Which I like, it's fine. I'm not upset about that. But when we get there, you expect us to sort it out. I got to sort it out and finish it in 5 minutes because I got 30 calls waiting on my MDT back in the unit. So I got to get back to these. There are other 30 calls, and I can't come back here tonight. So I got to finish this now in a way that it's at least done till the end of my shift because I don't want to come back. All right? So I'm very practical in that regard. So when you see what can solve a problem, you have a tendency to want to call it out and say, hey, here's the problem. You didn't call me here to give you the 30-year history of how you got to this moment. You called me because this moment is a problem for you. Mm-hmm. And I got to solve it and not come back. And I think that we have to take a similar approach when it's our kids. Now, look, we all have kids on the stage, and they all have a spectrum of commitment and a series of experiences they're going through. We don't raise automatic, deep disciples of Christ. We haven't all raised 3 or 4 Billy Grahams. The kids are kids, and they have the freedom. Now, I'm very hands-off for the most part. I don't panic. My kids know what's true. I've raised them to know what's true, but I didn't become a believer until I was 35. So I get it. I did a lot of stupid things until I was 35. So I'm okay if they do stupid things now. They're not 35. Now, maybe when they're 36, 37, I'll start panicking. But until then, I'm pretty much trusting that God will sort that out since I've already laid the foundation, right? But I did lay a foundation. And they knew that they weren't going to be able to offer these silly objections. They knew that those could be responded to. But they'll have something else. Remember that the tail that wags the dog is not the evidence anyway. It's that if you can give me some alternative worldview that will just work a little bit, but will allow me to sleep with my girlfriend and not feel bad about it,
right.
Goodbye Christianity.
That's right.
So all I need is something that practically works for the moment to reject this view. So they're already halfway out the door every day of their life because they want to chase their desires. Right? So it's a lot of this is you're kind of like swimming upstream.
Could you add to that the story you told in the pastor's lunch about Sean McDowell and Josh McDowell about why he felt good?
So we're writing a book together right now, and he's included this one as one of the stories, Sean and I. And he talks about how when he was a high schooler, he started to share with his dad that he wasn't quite sure this was all true. He tells this story constantly. I think Josh tells the story as well. And he talks about how, Sean came to Josh, and here Josh is a famous apologist. And, Dad, I'm not sure this is true. I'm sure I believe what you believe. And his dad was pretty unflinching on this. He didn't really react in any negative way at all. He just said, no problem. I'm glad you're questioning. I'm glad you're going to search through the evidence. I had to do that too. And off he goes. And so years later, he asked him, okay, you say that, but I know it must have bugged you, right? I mean, did you worry a little bit that this might turn out bad? And he said, no, I didn't worry because I knew the strength of our relationship. And I think that's interesting because he could have said, I knew the strength of the evidence.
Right.
But he didn't say that. He said, I knew the strength of our relationship. So we have to remember that, it's one thing for me to get up on the stage and give you 50 points of evidence, information, truth. But I don't have a relationship with you. And we try as speakers to form a relationship with an audience, but in the end, you have true relationships with several people. And it's in the context of those relationships that you need to be the authority on these topics. Look, I'll tell you something. A lot of you in this room, we're in Kentucky. Are you all basketball fans?
Well, yeah.
Okay.
Of course.
So, but did you watch the Duke game though, right?
No. Hey, we're done.
Do I need to say anymore?
Thank you for coming. Appreciate. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. I'll bet you there are people in this room who could give me the history of Duke basketball going back when Cal first started. Okay. I bet you there are people in this room that could give me a better rundown of the history of Kentucky basketball than they could give me of church history. I know there are. So what you guys have done is you've shown your kids your priorities. And you will raise up excellent fans of Kentucky basketball. Right? Wow. So it's really about, that's what it is. So it is, unfortunately. Now look, here's the thing. I feel guilty enough as a parent. And you don't need somebody else making you feel guilty too. Right. But there's a great thing about this is that we can be repentant in front of our kids also. Yeah. And that works just as well. Yes. So if that hasn't been you up to this point, change that and tell your kids why you're doing it. And then that works just as well.
Yeah.
So
that's good. My kids have been trained about Jesus and Kentucky basketball.
Okay.
All right.
In that order? In that order?
Yeah, Jesus first.
Okay, all right.
Right? I mean, some of them are here. Yeah, see, there you go.
Okay. All right, cool. So it wasn't that order. All right, good. All
right. Given that morality is not universal, that was actually a powerful analogy, actually. I didn't like it, but it was powerful. Given that morality is not universal, there are cultures with different core traditions. How can you prove that it exists within us?
Okay, say that question again.
Given that morality is not universal, different cultures have different core traditions. How can you prove that it exists within us?
Okay, I'm not sure that first affirmation is even true.
Right.
I would push back on the first claim.
Yep.
I think what you're saying core moral.
I'm not saying I'm
right.
wrong.
The person's saying core. Now I think what you'll see is that there are some surface variations of cores,
Right.
but the cores are still cores.
Yeah.
So those don't change. It's never okay to torture babies for fun. Never has been, never will be. That might be expressed in different ways, but that's an affirmation, a moral truth claim that is objective, and it transcends all cultures, it transcends all history. If there's actually a Star Trek universe, it's not okay to torture Klingon babies for fun. It actually transcends worlds. So now you have this thing that transcends all of us. And remember that moral truths are not simply truth claims. These are obligations. You have a sense that there are a set of transcendent moral obligations. Now that's weird, right? Because I have no moral obligations to this table. I can do anything I want to it. It will not be considered morally wrong. But I do have a moral obligation to the person standing beside the table. Moral obligations are only between persons. They aren't between objects, they're between persons. That means that if all that controls the universe is physics, where do we get a transcendent moral obligation? You're never obligated to physics. The best explanation for transcendent objective moral obligations is an objective transcendent moral person
Right.
to whom we are feeling obligated.
Right.
So I think that for me says of the two kinds of forces that could govern the universe, personal forces or impersonal law, like physics, the better explanation for moral truth is always going to be a personal cause, because these are obligations and we feel them. And I think that they are, look, if you said, okay, one simple way is to go through the alternatives. Okay, the alternatives are what? That moral obligations are simply personal opinion? Well, then if you think it's okay to punch him and you think it's not okay, how do I adjudicate between those two people? You're saying that everyone makes these decisions in their own mind, therefore no one person is more right or wrong than the person sitting next to them. So now I can't even adjudicate between two different claims. Well, if you say, well, no, it's not persons, it's groups. As nations, we decide things. Okay, fine. So you as a nation decide it's okay to punch him. You as a nation decide it's not okay to punch him. Well, who gets to decide who's right here? How do I adjudicate between consensus?
Right.
It's still subjective. It's just not one subject, it's 50. Now you could say, well, that group's larger than ours. Are you ready to bow your knee, to bow your will to the Chinese? They outnumber us. Doesn't make what they say right, though, morally right. Size does not make right. Agreed? Mm-hmm. So now we're stuck. We've got it transcends individuals. It transcends groups. What's left? We need a transcendent foundation for these things that will explain and help us to adjudicate. So in Nuremberg, when they came and said, hey, you can't send us to the death penalty just because we killed all these Jews. In our country, it was legal to do this. As a matter of fact, we were rewarded and promoted for doing this. Now you happen to win the war and you want to put us to death for what our country, our group said was okay? And we were the most powerful group at the time. And what did our Justice Jackson, and what did he say? He said, oh, yeah, really? No, there's a law above the law. Mm-hmm. But what is the law above the law? We have to figure out how that is grounded. This is not to say that you cannot behave morally without grounding it in God. Of course you can. I know a lot of atheists that behave a lot better than us. But you can't ground that behavior. You're borrowing from a theistic worldview to live as an atheist. Right. My friend Frank Turek says it all the time, that you have to borrow consistently from a theistic worldview to get reason, morality, a lot of things. You have to sit in God's lap in order to slap him in the face. And that's exactly what we're doing sometimes.
I think it's completely right that the naturalistic worldview, the whole modern post-Darwinian so-called scientific worldview of human morality is literally that it is a naturalistic evolutionary development from animal emotions. And there are philosophical versions of it, but that is the so-called long-standing scientific view. If you think that'll work. On the other side, people call it, post-existentialism, postmodernism, or whatever, postmodernism, which is you get to make it up and identify yourself whatever you want. So there are many different ways you can converge over the last 200 to 300 years on something that says there really is no ultimate right or wrong. But here's one thing that I think Christianity makes way more sense about all this. Number one, I disagree also that there's no core objective value that transcends cultures. That's why we can do international business throughout the centuries. Human beings don't look at each other and go, there's just no way we can relate to you. That's just bogus. Christianity can account for, however, the variations in the way human beings do things. We believe in a broken world, right? Out of relationship with God. So it shouldn't be surprising that you can find cultures in the past that maybe did things that were atrocious and cultures in the present like Nazi Germany. The question really should be, are we strictly then, without any evidence that people, even claiming there is no objective value, that they really live as if there's no objective value, and that's just false. They all do. Everybody does, including the people with the most ardent defenses. Look how mad they get when whatever the issue that works for them, and it could be some issue you think's insane, but they can get very passionate about it because they don't say, I just like this more. They don't fight over, I like coconut versus lemon meringue. They fight over, you're not loving and then fill in the blank enough, or you hate this, and so on. So it seems to me, in the end, you want to point this out to a person as do you really think that, say, for instance, Nazi Germany or slavery really aren't bad, they're just differences, and we can just go about that? Can we treat people any way we want, just as he said? So I think we can reason with a person to see and even account for those differences sometimes that are troubling, but in the end, none of us thinks we're the same thing as an animal. Nobody, when they see, let's say, a cheetah chase a gazelle down for lunch, say, murderer, or whatever, right? So we want to, as best the person's able to, be thoughtful and think about these things, because that really is at the heart of the gospel, isn't it? That there is truly some things to which we don't match up and we won't in this life, and that's why Jesus came. He came because we really have a fundamental problem so broken so badly that we cannot fix it. Only Christianity has that perspective, so we can't get away with just acting like, well, you have your morality, I have mine. Let's talk about Jesus. It just doesn't work that way.
And if you think you can't find those core values, look, just add the expression for the fun of it. You might say, well, no one should kill. Well, there are some justifications for killing, even in Scripture, in every culture, in our culture. Now, you might argue that everyone's culture's got different justifications. Okay, fine, add the expression for the fun of it. You should not kill for the fun of it is the core that everyone shares. You should not steal for the fun of it. You might be able to justify it in some conditions, and each culture might justify it differently. But every culture would agree you should not do it without justification. You should not steal for the fun of it. Lie for the fun of it. If you just add for the fun of it to the end of the act, you'll find the cores that every culture actually embraces. Those are the cores. Now, the top layers are how do we properly justify this thing at the core that we all agree we ought not do. The justifications will sometimes be different, but the cores are all the same.
Good. This question says, for all panelists, often in one's life, he or she has a point when his or her faith is fundamentally tested, whether it be a compelling argument or a life-shaking event for the worse. What points in your life have you had the greatest wave of temptation to leave the faith, and what helped you apologetically sustain you through that time?
Well, I don't have a story. So for me, I came to faith so late that I've been here because of the evidence, and so I don't feel like but I'm not somebody who was raised in the faith or who came to it earlier. I know you came a little bit earlier than me.
I wanted to say two things, because I think that, like Jim, I don't want to make this sound like a Superman. I honestly I said it this morning, not that I don't have doubts. I have things that I can say, man, I don't have a good answer for that. I wish I had a better answer for it. So I have things like that. It's just that in the ultimate sense, intellectually, I don't have doubts like, you know what, I just really think I ought to be an atheist or whatever. I don't. So I do think that there is something to do with the way we're made, maybe how we came to faith, but it isn't that we don't have doubts, okay? I think I've met some people that really, their faith is beat up, and so I'm wanting to add to that. I will say this, however, I've had a dark night of the soul, to mention John of the Cross, and your faith can be tested in a variety of ways. It isn't always just the intellectual issue. In 2001, I was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Now, a lot of people say you may look dead, but as far as I know, I'm really not. And if you do the math, it's a remarkable thing that to be told you had 3 years to live with multiple myeloma, which is like a blood cancer, lymphoma, leukemia, incurable. And I was right at a critical phase of my life. I was leaving Kentucky. I know you think that's why God caused it, but I don't believe that's the right way of thinking about it. It was at a critical moment in my life where I had all these plans that were for the Lord, of course, and all this sort of thing. And it was incredibly humbling. More humbling than the cancer were the treatments. I have never recovered fully from years of chemotherapy. I had this really quick, fast mind, and it's been sort of in slow-mo ever since. And it's tough. I can't multitask well. I can't, when I'm talking and thinking and lecturing or whatever. Used to be I'm planning what I'm having for dinner. I'm looking at why are you not more interested? And I got 17 things going on. Now I'm like, are your hands picking your ear, or what are you doing while you're talking? And it was very humbling. But worse was I had to confront who I was, and it was a moment where it was just me and the Lord for several years, and the side effects of drugs making me, for the first time and only time in my post-Christian experience, ever since I became a Christian experience, I found deep depression and feeling I could understand what it is to want to go to heaven. I told my wife one day, I said, if I weren't a Christian, I'd be ready to commit suicide. And I found this helpful to tell students who feel like you're never allowed to say those sorts of things as a Christian. So my faith has been tested in very, very deeper, in what I would consider deeper ways for me than it would have been if I'd have just been hit with something intellectual. I think I can handle intellectual challenges. Like I can set them. I look at it and I go, okay, that's a 7.5. That's pretty bad, but I don't have very many of them, and then no big deal. I couldn't put aside what I went through. And what I will say, and I'm happy to say, and it isn't like, oh boy, isn't he strong. I look at it as the amazing grace of the Lord is sufficient. When you get there for the time of the trial, you're not ready for it, you don't want it, but when you get there, and many of you have been through things far worse than I've been through. There are things way worse than dying and way worse than cancer and way worse than chemo. But the Lord is sufficient, isn't he? And it isn't about how smart we are or how strong we are. It's about how smart, or maybe we'd say, how wise and how good and strong he is. So, yeah my faith's been tested. But it isn't in that sort of intellectual thing. But we're all made differently. Our faith will be tested, just like the Lord said to Peter. Satan's asked permission. The good news is you're going to be okay. You're coming out on the other side because you belong to the Lord.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah,
that's to make you. By the way, that's to make you feel sorry for me and to think, wow, he. Just imagine, that explains why he's so pitiful or whatever. I use it as an excuse. I tell my students, if I don't make sense, assume I really did inside. If it sounds like I'm speaking in tongues, your job's to interpret. If I sound like I said something heretical, please ask. I may not have meant it that way.
Yeah.
So, it's a good excuse if you need it.
I think they already felt sorry for you because you got me as a student. So I think they already felt bad for you. For me to answer this question, I don't ever, contrary to these guys, I don't ever remember a time in my life when I didn't love Jesus. I'm not saying I was born again when I was born. I mean, I wasn't full of the Holy Ghost from the womb.
That's his mom and dad right down there.
Yeah, and my dad, they have plenty of evidence that I wasn't that great a kid. But I don't remember. I never had a time where I didn't love. I don't remember it. If I did, maybe I did. But I grew up loving Jesus, thinking he was awesome. Even before I prayed the sinner's prayer, I thought Jesus was amazing. And I don't, even in my darkest moments, I don't remember ever questioning that, but I questioned a lot of other stuff. Most notably when here in our church, two different men committed suicide, men that were under my care as a shepherd. And one of them I didn't see coming. There was no way I could have seen, but the other, I should have seen coming. And so after that, I wrote a resignation letter that I wasn't supposed to be a pastor anymore and all that stuff. And so that was for me kind of a dark night of the soul. And honestly, what helped me through that wasn't an apologetic argument. It was the men and women of New Life Church and my family that stood beside us. And it was the relational aspect that we mentioned earlier. That's what got me through that. And Jesus' mercy. Okay. You should never cry when you're trying to read stuff. It's a bad idea. I've heard it said, you can let a bird fly around your head, but don't let it make a nest. Okay? Is there a danger in exploring some of the atheist vitriol, and how can you learn and prepare with minimal damage?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
I think you're right. This is not something you don't go into foreign territory you've never been in without a guide, right?
Right.
So you wouldn't probably go into some crazy place you want to visit you've never been before and just think, I'm just going to go ahead and grab a stick and some hiking boots and just, if you've got a guide you can take, that'd be wiser. I think that's true too for this kind of thing. And so I would start with, sometimes the guides you start with are the people who are responding to the objections. So I would be okay with you actually reading those books first, or letting those people speak in your lives first, right? So they can kind of set the foundation for you. And that's not to say that because it's very true. Once you start wandering, or you were just saying it in the luncheon today, that you can get caught up. I know you can get caught up in just wandering through the internet from objection to objection, right? Right. And find yourself just now mired in the objections.
That's right.
Because in those websites, you're never going to give you the other side of it, right? So I think part of this for me would be, and I tell this to my students when we train students, is we do show them all the objections. We show them all the arguments. We kind of give them a Cliff Note version, because I know that my kids won't read anything anyway. They're in youth group, but the point is, I will give them the Cliff Note version, but I'm guiding them through that process. They're getting it narrated from Jim. Yes. And that's, I think, a helpful way to do it. So I think what you have to do is find the trusted advisors online. Look, you want to know what you love? Look at your podcasts. Do you guys podcast at all? Mm-hmm. Okay, so I listen to a lot of podcasts. You can kind of tell what my priorities are based on my podcasts. Unfortunately, most of which are ESPN and Fox Sports. Okay, I'll admit that now, okay? But once I get past that, they're kind of divided between theology, apologetics, and sports. But I have trusted advisors in all three of those areas that help guide me through the issues. I wouldn't just jump in full. I wouldn't take all those off and just now line up the top 20 atheist podcasters. I need to be guided through that process myself, especially if it's science, right? If it's something about fine-tuning, well, I know people who I trust to guide me through that process. Right. If it's fine-tuning, I'm probably trusting someone like Hugh Ross or Jeff Zwirink, somebody who's an astrophysicist who can help me, guide me through this process. But I have a collection of people in my mind that I know I go to as first resources in every one of these areas. Yeah. And if all you did was have in your own mind, well, who's my go-to guy or gal in that field of expertise who has already addressed those issues? Well, and also there's several good podcasts that are out there in which both sides are allowed to fairly present their side. One is called Unbelievable. Have you heard this podcast? Very, very popular podcast in the UK. Every episode is an atheist and a Christian calmly discussing an issue of disagreement. So at least in that setting, you got a narrator a guy who's litigating this conversation, basically, right? And so it's not going to be all one-sided. So that's a good place to get both sides fairly, but without being overwhelmed by one side or the other. But I think what I've done is I've collected a list of resources that I know are my go-to people for these kinds of things, whatever it may be. That make sense? Mm-hmm. And sometimes you can find that because most of us who write books, we will have in our bibliography, we'll have in our index, all the people so all the books I write, I try to give you, 3 people who argue it from the Christian perspective, 3 who argue it from an atheist perspective. And I put that in my bibliography so you have it. So you can know who to. And I would probably read the Christian book first. If you're concerned that you don't know enough about science, you might be persuaded falsely by what sounds like a good argument. Well, then if you think that you're good enough in science, then you can read them in any order you want. But if you're not, let the guide you.
By the way, I don't want you to quit hitting me. It shows how much you like me.
That's right.
And I like that. I think from what I've heard, that old quote about the birds but don't let them nest is a Luther quote related to temptation. You can't stop temptation from coming your way. You just don't have to let it take hold. And I think with regard to the answer about apologetics and studying atheists and all of this sort of thing, exactly what he said is the right way to go. If you ignore it, then it won't ignore you. It's going to come after you. It's going to come after at least your kids and those you love and those around you, and you're going to be an ineffective witness and so on. And kind of the description of using trusted sources is also helpful, it seems to me, an idea I heard years ago that's easy to say, not as easy to do, but this gives you the general direction of this. A guy was talking about the way you raise your children, and he said, some people have these extremes. One, they immerse their kids in the culture and hope they turn out okay. And he said, they lose them before they leave home. And others isolate them, they're like no television, no radio, no nothing, honey. And the kid leaves home and can't figure out how to relate to the culture at all and usually falls in as well. So he suggested the ideal is inoculation. He must have been a Baptist preacher. And the idea is you give them little bits as they're able to handle it. So they develop an immunity to it. And trusting someone like this, a relationship, parent, trusted sources, you give them what they can handle so that by the time they leave home, they're strong. And I think this is true for you. I remember when I first, as a baby Christian, just the way I was made, I moved into a house 3 weeks after I became a Christian with some other guys that led to the Lord, a little rent house, and it just so happened to be that it was behind a Jehovah's Witness Kingdom Hall. So to earn their salvation, to at least try to get into the millennium to earn their salvation, they were always coming to my door because I was the guy easy to beat up. And so I view it this way: whatever comes your way when you're witnessing or what you're encountering that are tough for you, that's probably a pretty good clue. It's time for you to start learning about it. Don't ignore it. And so I learned a whole lot about JWs way back then. And over time, I would, maybe it was evolution or whatever. And some people say, "Oh, don't study that; it'll mess you up." See, I think that's just the opposite. It'll come after some people in our circles if we don't. But this is the way to do it, the way Jim suggested.
Yeah, good. There's still quite a number of questions here, but because we're running out of time, why don't we open it up to the floor? I got a couple people with microphones. So if you have a question that you think a lot of people might have, raise your hand, and then they'll come to you with the mic. We got just a few more minutes, so we'll probably only be able to do a couple. We have, okay, right here, and then there's one back there too.
My question is for you, Jim. I've always been troubled by this, and that's why you're the only detective I haven't really met you, but that I have been able to pose a question to, and that is, why is it assumed that it's okay to lie in an interview and obtain a confession from what I would consider illegal means?
Okay, a couple of things. You're not allowed to obtain the confession from illegal means. So we're not allowed to say something that would compel someone to tell us something that's untrue. But we can say something that would compel people to tell us something that is true. Let me give you an example. I cannot say to you, unless you can tell me the truth, unless you tell me you did this. I've got your kid in the next room. And I've got Child Protective Services here. You tell me you did this, or I'm going to have him take your custody away from your kids. Now, that would compel somebody to tell me anything to avoid this thing that's a lie. I'm not going to do that. But now I've actually said something that's coercive because you're just trying to keep your kid in your custody. Okay, so you're going to tell me anything. On the other hand, I could say, like I said in the example, look, dude, I know what you did in there. I have a video of the entire thing. I already know the answer to these questions. I'm not asking you these questions to get to the truth of the matter. I'm only asking these questions to see if you're a truth teller. And I already have the video. I've already looked at it. So now tell me exactly what you do when you walked in the room.
But you don't.
Well, I don't have the video. Now this is not going to compel a lie because clearly if he lies to me, I would know in my mind, right? He thinks if he lies to me that I'm only going to know from the video. And this actually compels a truth statement, not a lie, because there's nothing hanging in the balance like I'm going to take your kids away from you if you don't say you did it. Follow me? Now, you'll see sometimes in interviews that are posted on bad cases where bad interviewers will do something that is actually coercive. Now, here's the second question, though, is, but why would that on its face be allowable? Well, this is this lesser of evils that we were coming at, that the law comes at. The law says, look, you have this evil, you have to tell a lie. You have a greater evil, a murder is going to go unpunished. So we're going to allow you to tell the lie as long as it's not coercive, which we consider to be the lesser of two evils.
But the other side of that is that there are people, at least I've known people, that would agree to what they hadn't done.
Yeah, but did you see how I posed it? I didn't say, I saw you go in the room and do this. I said, tell me, well, I have a video already. He doesn't even know what to say to me. He has no idea what I want him to say because I have not given him yet what I want him to say.
I got it.
So that's the difference.
Okay.
So if I'm going to go in and say, hey, you need to tell me this, 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 and this. Yes, there are people who just want to please you, and they'll tell you this, 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 and this. So if this guy says to me, well, I don't know what you want me to say. The truth of what you did, whatever you did when you wanted us in the room. I saw it. Just tell me the truth of what you did. Well, tell me what you want me to say I did. Just the truth of whatever you did. I'm not going to give him what I want him to say because I know when we play this for the jury, I'm going to be accused of coercing him. So for no other reason, I just want to make this, I know in the end, I put everything on tape. So in the end, this is all going to be reviewed by not only the jury, but it'll be reviewed in two levels of appeal. It's got to win all the way up. So I'm going to make sure I don't seed anything to you. I don't plant a seed for anything. I'm just going to say I got the video, and it shows me something, and you. Now, of course, when we talk about the illustrations in the room, that's different. We're just goofing off. But here, in a real trial, I'm going to have to leave it so open-ended that there's no even a perception that I am leading him anywhere.
And I don't have marijuana anymore.
That's right. So he's okay.
Hey, it's statute of limitations. You're good.
You're good.
Yeah. There was one back here somewhere. Oh, Tammy, can you run back there, Kevin?
Okay, talking about healing. Healing is a subject where a lot of people don't get healed.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people die every day, believers, non-believers, whatever, of a sickness, of a disease. You
Yes.
know, rarely do people die just their body just stops.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you minister to somebody who had many people die of a sickness, and you know, we have healing, but there's no evidence of healing in a lot of. And you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, let me repeat it back to you. So the problem is if we're saying that all evil can be explained because we have this free agency, and some people will misbehave because that free agency is given to us by God, that explains why some people might die of being killed. But how do you explain deaths that are just from disease or from some other mechanism? Where's the loving God? Where's the all-powerful God that can stop it? Why would he prevent that form of death, not the murder? How do we explain terrible diseases that are painful and you finally die? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Okay.
In the sense of like when you minister to somebody, I mean, I don't know because I'm not God, of course, you know.
Yeah.
You know, a person could be anybody, you know, no matter what a lot of people die of sickness.
Yeah.
You know, I know there's forces in the world that have to do with how we eat, our environment, this and that, but if healing is for us, how do you, and this person is struggling with God with this, how do I explain that? I don't have an answer for that.
Well, you remember when we did that case with the man with the club, with the bat? It was a cumulative case, right? There's like 8 reasons why we know he's involved. And when we made the case for Christianity, there's a big, large cumulative case, death by 1,000 paper cuts. I actually think that responding to the problem of evil is difficult because it's a cumulative case. It's not just one thing, ever one thing that explains this, but there are some things that I think do a better job of explaining than others. Now, I'll tell you that it's true. It's easier sometimes to say, well, why is there evil in the world? Well, a lot of our answer to this is we say free agency. That argument from free agency, it solves a lot of it, we think. I'm not trying to solve it. I'm trying to explain it. Now, I would say this to you. I think there's 7 things. I'm not going to get into it today. But there are 7 things that I think in total explain why God would allow any particular act of evil. And I've just always measured these through the cases I work, all of which are singular acts of evil that families have asked me to explain. And I think there are 7 things that would explain any act of evil. But the one I think is at the primary position in all of these is an issue that probably hardly anyone ever talks about. And it is this. As an atheist, I saw life as a line segment, okay, from birth to another point called death. I want 90 years in that line segment, if you ask me. I want 90 pain-free years where I'm actually still running. I want to be able to jog through all 90 years. Or I want to die peacefully in my sleep, no disease, no nothing. That's my goal. As an atheist, that was my goal. And if I'd have gotten cancer at 40 and then suffered for 10 years and then died, I just saw that as evil because I expected the line segment to be 90 pain-free. And instead, I'm only getting 40, and I'm getting like 50, but the last 10 are terrible. Why? Who wants to die like this? Where's God in all this? But what if my initial foundational view of life is incorrect? What if life is not a line segment from point to point, but is instead a ray? It starts at a point, goes through the second point, and then off infinitely. That's what rays do. They start at a point, they go through a second point, and they continue infinitely. Mm-hmm. And that changes everything, because think about this for a second. Some of you in this room have suffered some surgery when you were an infant, because you had to correct a heart valve or something, and you had a terrible first 2 weeks. And if I'd have stopped you in the first 2 weeks and said, how's life going for you? You'd have said, it's terrible, it's all pain. Why even be here? But by the time you're 3, you've already forgotten all of it. You're living as though you never had those first 2 weeks, because evil and pain and suffering are always measured in the context of where you are now in your life. So think about this. If life is really a ray, starts at birth, goes to the point called death, and then goes off infinitely, every year that you're on the infinite side of that thing we used to call death, your line segment part is actually shorter and shorter relative to the ray part. So 1,000,000 years into eternity, whatever you experience for 90 years, or even if it's 90 years of just terrible, 90 years of ugly, is a millisecond compared to the 1,000,000 years you're now in eternity. So here's what happens, is that we struggle with these ideas because we call ourselves Christians, but we hold a worldview that's closer to atheism. Yes, evil is a problem for atheists. It ought to be. You've only got 90 years to get all joy, all pleasure, all justice. But that's not us. As Christians, we know we have eternity. We're all born from the very beginning as eternal creatures. Yes, you might have a crummy first millisecond, which is what 90 years is going to feel like compared to eternity.
Right.
So we have to live, I think, consistently with our worldview. That helped me, at least.
Yeah.
Pastor Tim also, that was terrific. Pastor Tim also hit on something important, because you talked about how do you minister to them. So you may have a friend or someone that you're thinking of who's going through this. I had times as a pastor, I used to teach this subject similar to the way Pastor Tim and Jim were also, but I only try to do it when there was a sense in which we were fairly healthy as a church. There wasn't something really tough going on that was consuming everybody's heart and mind. And as I see it in the Bible, we strengthen ourselves with the Word of God and these kinds of understandings when we're not in the midst of the trial, ideally. We try to build ourselves up, arm ourselves for the purpose of suffering, as Peter wrote. But when a person's in the middle of the trial, sometimes they may say, why? The Bible has that a lot in the Psalms. I had a lady once, her son had died in his early 30s. He'd just come to Jesus. We'd just led him to the Lord. He was a semi-professional football player, a huge mountain of a man, but for years he had been consuming a fifth of alcohol a day of whiskey. And his liver was gone, and he died. The Lord didn't heal him just because he became a Christian. And she looked at me after the funeral, and she had this, we loved her in our church, and these just crocodile tears. She looked me right in the eye when I went to see her, and she said, with this great Texas drawl, Brother Ted, why did the Lord take my Billy? And she really didn't want me to say, well, because he drank every day for years, or any other even theological reason. At that moment, she was just hurting. So it depends if your friend is a Christian or not a Christian, where they are spiritually. And I'm glad they have somebody like you there to love on them and to show them Jesus. And as they're able to hear it at the right times, talk about some of these hopes that we have and so on.
All right, our time is gone, but we're not going to run away. If anybody wants to come up and ask questions after we're dismissed. Thank you guys for being here today. I think it was a super helpful day. And tomorrow, Jim is going to be ministering on our regular Sunday morning service. If you don't already have a church, love to see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. So God bless you guys. We're dismissed.